Australian National University Infectious Diseases physician, Professor Peta Collignon, joins me now via Skype. Professor, thank you very much for your time. We're going to rely on your expertise here because there was a lot of sort of caveats put around this modelling released by the government. This was modelling, they say, that's highly theoretical. It models out worst case scenarios. It was done by the Doherty Institute in Melbourne, but the inputs, the caseload inputs came from overseas, so they don't say it necessarily applies to the Australian example, but it was what the government had in front of them when they looked at how bad this could possibly get in Australia and what sort of resources they might need. What did you find interesting as you worked your way through the modelling?
Well, I think the caveats that the Prime Minister mentioned are all very valid. This is based on mainly overseas data, which is quite different to Australia. And perversely, because we've more than flattened the epidemic curve, we've made it go down. And that's fairly unique around the world. Now, maybe lucky because it was summer here and then autumn, but we need to remember we're in a very good position with a lot less or very little local spread currently. But the trouble with all models is we need them because we've got to actually work out, well, what might happen if we go the way of overseas countries. Now, I might say I think that's unlikely because the US, New York, London, Italy, they probably had 2 months of uncontrolled and increasing spread in the community that we have not had and we're unlikely to have. So that's very important with the inputs in any models. If you look at a lot of the assumptions of the models, they talk about something called RO, which is the number of people that the virus spreads from. And most of these models assume that it's got an RO of 2 or more. In other words, that means that one person gives it to 2 or more people, and then those 2 people give it to 4 or more people, and onwards. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's a real problem with that assumption. First of all, that assumes that you do nothing to control it. And secondly, if we look at this compared to, say, swine flu, I actually think this virus is about 10 times more deadly than swine flu on the available data we have now. But I also think it probably spreads less because a lot of countries around the world tried to stop swine flu from spreading, including Australia, and no country was successful. Once it got in, it went through at least 10, 20% of the population. That doesn't seem to be the case with this virus. And particularly once we do things, we make the spread less. So, for instance, our epidemic curve by falling means since March 25, less than one person has got this infection from another person. Otherwise, the curve would not be falling. And even the disaster...
Let's see if I could put up... Let me just, sorry to interrupt, let me see if I can put up a world graph there because I think that also goes to your point. It's there and you can see where Australia has gone up, where a whole lot of other countries had gone up. We're just there below South Korea. And it's really started to move laterally across the screen, horizontally across the screen. And as we saw in the day-by-day data in the earlier graph, really starting to fall off. I want to know, Professor, one of the interesting things, of course, being in the Southern Hemisphere, is all of those other countries have got this disaster hitting them at the same time as seasonal flus and people being inside in closed environments. It's winter, of course. We've got it at a better time of the year, I suppose, but we're also heading into some of our worst weather and seasonal flu epidemics anyway. How dangerous is it for us at this point in time, being April, if we stupidly think that we've won the war?
Well, I think that would be very unwise. Winter is going to be our most dangerous period because that's when all respiratory viruses transmit more often. But just looking at the curves you look at, they're what we call cumulative curves. Now, those curves can never fall, even if you have no more cases. When we're talking about flattening the curve, we're talking about the epidemic curve. In other words, the number of cases that occur per day. Ours peaked on the 25th of March and is going down. And the fact that it's flattening, ours is most similar to South Korea, which was in winter, I might say, when they had their outbreak. So it's not actually hopeless that we're going to have uncontrolled cases in winter because South Korea didn't during their winter. But it really does mean all the things that make sense. Distancing, don't go to work if you're unwell, don't see people if you're unwell, if it's a sniffle or anything else, keeping our clubs closed, our pubs closed, all those other things that actually have made a difference for how many people you're closely interacting with and therefore the chance that you can spread this. And the graph you've got up now, it's the blue line is one curve, but it's really the orange lines, I presume, that is what we call the epidemic curve. You can see they have gone up and up. but now they're going down. That's a very good sign, and we run the risk when winter comes, it might go up again. But if we do all the things we've been doing and had in place between the 20th and 25th of March, that should decrease markedly the chance that that will happen and not get us into the same position as New York or London, where they basically didn't do anything because they didn't realise they had a problem.
Yeah, and look, just that curve there with the orange bars is a graph that came out of the Prime Minister's analysis and modelling released today. That is a government graph there. I just want to ask you before we go, Professor, are you surprised that we've been able to, what would seem at this early stage, turn the table as much as we have and as quickly as we have?
Yes, I am a bit surprised because I don't think any modelling predicted our curve, our epidemic curve, would be as low as this and go down. I've even put myself out a few weeks ago in an article in the Canberra Times suggesting, look, all these 20,000, 30,000 deaths by the end of May, I thought were probably exaggerated, but I did actually still think we'd have a few hundred deaths. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I overestimated. But I'm only really willing to predict what might happen till the end of May. Come winter, we need more data, particularly from China, which hasn't produced as much data as it should on what we call antibody studies. How widely does this infection really go? We need data from the US, we need data from Europe, so that we can better model not only from what's happening overseas, but more importantly, what we see has happened here and what things we put in place, which was mainly between the 20th and 25th of March, what we did then that has made all the difference to get this curve falling faster and at a lower rate than what anybody would have expected a couple of months ago.
Well, cautiously optimistic, that's I think where we'll land tonight. Professor Peta Credlin, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.